What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Hidden Forces with me, Demetri Kofinas. Today, we speak with philosopher and theologian Mark C. Taylor. Mark is professor of religion at Columbia University and a leading figure in debates about postmodernism. He has written on topics ranging from philosophy, religion, literature, art, and architecture, to education, media, science, technology, and economics. He has authored 30 books, among which include Journeys to Selfhood, Hegel and Kierkegaard, About Religion, Economies of Faith in Virtual Culture, The Moment of Complexity, and my personal favorite, Speed Limits, Where Time Went and Why We Have So Little Left. In this episode, we cover everything from religion to finance to art to technology. Most importantly, we take this journey as individuals, exploring the paths blazed for us by Luther and his Protestant Reformation, building on the works of Ockham and Thomas Aquinas. We will learn about economic philosophers like Adam Smith and Friedrich Hayek, who addressed the problems of non-linearity, information networks, and how complex systems create order from chaos. We will look at how technology, for all its benefits, still leaves something to be desired. A fundamental contradiction, perhaps, in its application to the human experience. Lastly, we will ask the question, what is it all for? What does it all mean? Where are we going? And why the great hurry? Here is that conversation. All right, after reading Speed Limits, and I was just mentioning to you before we started that this was a really influential book for me when I came across it in 2000, very beginning of 2015. I was looking for something very much along these lines that sort of took a look at technology, took a look at its impact on society, its impact on culture, psychology, and the individual. Because I was experiencing it myself in my life. At that time, I found myself struggling, trying to sort of get a clear direction and a sense of where I wanted to go, what I wanted to do, and I found myself just on a very basic level struggling to concentrate. I felt ungrounded, and in fact, while I was reading your book, was when I had an iPhone 6, and I took out the card and I replaced it with an iPhone, an older version of an iPhone, which the only thing I had on that iPhone was the telephone. And I went for only like a week with nothing but telephone. But it was like a cold turkey experience. And then when I went back to having a regular iPhone, I stopped that incessant interaction. So I was reading your book, and it just spoke to me so much in terms of where I was at and what I was looking for. But it was so much richer than I expected. I don't fully know your background, so why don't we start with you sort of telling us what is your background and exactly how did that all come together into this book, because it seems sort of outside of what you normally write or lecture about.
Well, it's a long story. I mean, I started as an undergraduate at Wesleyan University studying 19th century philosophy, Hegel and Kierkegaard, and then went on to Harvard to get a PhD in religion and eventually a doctorate from the University of Copenhagen in philosophy, still studying 19th century philosophy. And in fact, all of my thinking continues to go back to that material. After I finished my Harvard doctorate, I started teaching at Williams College in Massachusetts and taught. It's an excellent undergraduate institution where I taught for over 35 years. Eventually, the college, because my interests ranged quite broadly, the college let me teach independent of any department. I had like college wide appointment. So I was in no department and could teach basically anything I wanted. And as my thinking evolved, I moved from philosophy, religion and philosophy, to literature, to art and technology, eventually to finance, to internet.
When did you get into the finance subject?
I always tell the story. A lot of what I was doing in the 80s involved what's called postmodern art and architecture. And I always knew that in the 80s, a new form of capitalism was emerging. We'd had agricultural capitalism, industrial capitalism, consumer capitalism. And what was emerging was what I called finance capitalism. And in 1987, there was a stock market crash, and my son was about 14 years old at the time. And I said to him the day, I thought the world had really changed when the market crashed. Because at the time, I don't remember the percentages, but it was the largest single-day crash since the Depression. And I said to my son, who now is in finance, I said, something really weird happened yesterday. He said, yeah, what? I said, the stock market plummeted and billions and billions and billions of dollars were lost in an instant. And he said to me, where'd they go? And I had no answer for that question. And I finally said to him, I said, well, I guess in a certain sense they were never there in the first place. And he said, so then what's the problem? And in fact, he proved to be right, because not very long thereafter, the market was back up to where it had been. But if you know anything about postmodern art and architecture, you think of the photographs of Cindy Sherman, the photographs of other photographs, or paintings that copy other paintings. And the way in which that is expressed philosophically is to say that what happens is a change in the notion of representation. Rather than having signs represent things or objects, signs are always signs of other signs. So you have signs that are unanchored by anything else.
So you're describing sort of multi-order derivatives.
Yeah, but then I think economics is too important to be left to economists. I mean, one of the problems that has happened in higher education, and this is related to some of the other issues we might talk about, is that there's been hyper-specialization and professionalization. So academic studies in the university is more and more about less and less. And it's not just that people don't connect the dots. People don't even know what the dots are to connect. And to understand any of these social, economic, and cultural phenomena, you have to understand how they relate to everything else. So what was clear to me was that finance capitalism was, in effect, the economic expression of postmodern art and architecture. Or conversely, postmodern art and architecture reflect this new form of finance capitalism. I also saw this as...
Well, how is that? Can you explain that? So what do you mean exactly? Because I'm not, I actually learned a lot about art from reading your book. So that just shows you how little I knew. It wasn't even mostly about art. So it's not complicated enough yet. So let me put in one other strand and then come back to answer your question. I started with a study of religion, as I said. And in the 60s, I graduated in 1968, which was quite an interesting year. But in the 60s, when I was studying religion at Wesleyan, one of the most important movements of theology was called the death of God theology. And this death of God theology was, in fact, grew out of the work of a good friend of mine, Thomas Altizer, who developed Hegel's philosophy into this theology. So by 1973, it seemed to me that some of these trajectories were coming together. And one of the ways in which I expressed this was to say that the death of God is that going off the gold standard is the economic equivalent of the death of God. We went off the gold standard between 1971 and 1973. Whenever there's a war historically, countries go off the gold standard so they can print money in order to finance the war. So during the Second World War, the United States and other countries went off the gold standard. As the war began to wind down, what happened was that the United States and Great Britain came together up in New Hampshire at a place called Bretton Woods and laid out the blueprint for the post-war economy. And what they did in what came to be known as the Bretton Woods Agreement, it was John Maynard Keynes and Henry Dexter White from the United States. What they did was to
assert a modified gold standard. And what they did to do that, what they did was they linked the dollar to gold at a fixed rate of exchange of about $35 per ounce. I think it's up over a couple thousand now, and linked all other currencies to the dollar. In 1971, Nixon was president, William Connolly was the Secretary of the Treasury. Because of the pressures created by the war in Vietnam and its expense, the first Arab oil embargo, the expenses of the Great Society, Nixon unlinked the dollar from gold, but tried to maintain fixed exchange rates. That worked for only 2 years. At that point, they let the currencies float. Under the previous exchange, to go back now to the issue of representation, the value of the dollar was a function of its relationship to gold. The dollar is the signifier, the gold is the signified. So the material referent, gold, secures the value of the dollar, paper. Right. Now, the fact of the matter is that gold does not, contrary to the insistence of many, have an intrinsic value. Nothing has an intrinsic value. Things are valued only because people value them. So gold is not, in effect, a referent. Gold is, in fact, simply another sign. So the sign, the dollar, is not a referent for a real thing. It's the referent for another sign, gold. Gold and God are both signs constructed to deny their status as sign and thereby ground all other signs.
What do you mean by that? That's where you lost me. That part right there. That God.
So what's the base?
Else.
What's the ground of of value for people in a traditional theology? I mean, something is right because reality, because it's grounded in reality that God has created. So it's the reality of God, which in linguistics terms called the transcendental signified, that secures the meaning and value of all other signs. Gold functions the same way, to ground the value of.
So what you're saying? Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to. So what you're basically doing is you're drawing a comparison between a world living under either the gold standard or Bretton Woods, which is a sort of slight gold standard, to a theological universe, a theological world in which religion is pervasive and it is the bedrock of society. Once
one acknowledges that gold has no intrinsic value, but is simply valued because others value it. Or once you insist, and we have the processes of secularization and modernization going on in the 60s and 70s, that God is not actually a reality, but is a human construct to serve certain functions, whether it's Freud, Marx, or any of the others. So that once you have that situation, what had been taken to be the secure foundation is merely another sign created for a certain purpose. So the sign is not a referent for something that's real, but it's only the sign for another sign. Now, go back to the Bretton Woods. What they did was to unlink the dollar from gold, try to maintain fixed exchange rates. Fixed exchange rates failed, and in 1973, what they did was to let all the currencies float. When the currencies floated, the value of the currency was its relationship to other currencies. That is to say, it's thoroughly relative and constantly fluctuating. The other thing that happened in 1973 was that Reuters instituted the first global electronic currency exchange system. So that what happens at that point is that currency becomes quite literally current, that is, electrical current. Mm-hmm. And the value of these currencies is a function of this constant fluctuation within the electrosphere. Now, what happens in computers are not introduced to the trading floor until the late 1970s. The world didn't change with the introduction of computers to the trading floor. It changed when these computers were networked. Those networks were at first proprietary and were eventually opened up. Once you have the decoupling of the dollar from gold and an electronic global currency, you have the conditions for what becomes finance capitalism, which is what we are living in now. And in the years since then, those networks have gone global. the computers have become massively high speed, and we've developed the capacity for big data. With that, you have a completely new financial system.
I'd throw in there also automation. Obviously, the automation.
Yeah, automation. I mean, that goes with the acceleration of the computers, because now over 70% of the trades are algorithmic and occur at speeds that vastly exceed the human capacity for intervention. And a great many of the financial problems that we currently have are a function of this new system.
Help me bridge the gap with the art, because I just wanted to answer that, how the art factored into your work.
So let me go back to the end of the 18th century and Hegel and Kierkegaard. The basic ideas that are the foundation of modern culture were formed in Germany, more particularly in a small duchy called Jena in the 1790s. The major philosopher in the 18th century is a guy by the name of Immanuel Kant. In the 1790s, a group of influential philosophers and theologians, the primary of which was Hegel, were living together in this small duchy and developing ideas that came out of Kant's system. Kant had three major books, he called them critiques, one in which he considered the problem of knowledge, the true, one of which he considered the problem of ethics, the good, and the final, the problem of aesthetics, the beautiful. In his third critique of judgment, which is on beauty, he developed a notion of art that forms the foundation of the notion of modern art all the way down to the present day. And he did that by making a distinction between high art and low art. And the reason that distinction emerged at that time was that up until let me back. The reason that distinction emerged at that time was there was a change in the patronage system. Historically, there have been three patronage systems: the church, the state, and private. Kant was writing at the time of the shift from church to state. And the patronage system had broken down, and artists had to get a day job. In order to support themselves, they had to produce art for the market. That was called low art or craft. Clement Greenberg, the one who established the canonical notion of modernist art in this country, borrows this idea directly from Kant, and he acknowledges it, and he calls that low art kitsch. In contrast, high art is art that's done for art's sake, only for other artists. So it's not to be marketed. It's done solely for aesthetic purpose. Of course, it always gets appropriated and put into an economic system and so forth.
So basically, for people, I mean, what you're saying is, a Michelangelo was a high artist, a Warhol was a low artist based on these definitions.
Correct. Although
Warhol was a very brilliant entrepreneur.
What Warhol does is to collapse high and low. I mean, Warhol says at one point that business is the next art that comes after the art at its present stage. And he says explicitly he wants to be good at business because being good at business is being good at art. Now, Warhol was engaging in this with a certain sense of irony. His contemporary followers, the primary one of which is Jeff Koons or Damien Hirst, they carry Warhol's position on art as business to an extraordinary extreme. And they are, Warhol and Damien Hirst are in effect, I mean, Warhol's working off of consumer capitalism. It's images of consumer products, Brillo boxes, tomato cans. Mm-hmm.
And for people, just to clarify, because I'm sure many people, this is getting, even though this is common history, I'm sure a lot of people are not familiar with it. Warhol was essentially, perhaps, I mean, I don't know the terminology for what stage of art, but he's the artist most associated with creating images that really capture the consumerism that came after World War II.
Pop art.
Pop art, like the Madonna and the Coca-Cola
Right. I mean,
cans.
so-called high art always. Think of high art as very abstract. Right. So abstract expressionism was the art of the day when Warhol arrived on the stream. It was non-representational. There were no recognizable images in it. You had the same thing in architecture. In architecture, high modern architecture, think of it as your classical skyscrapers in New York City. The first of those was on Fifth Avenue, was the Seagram's building on Park Avenue. Mies van der Rohe designed that. And Mies van der Rohe is the one who famously said less is more. Right? So they would strip away all ornamentation until you got to pure structure. Postmodern architects come along, and rather than stripping away all images to get to pure structure, they appropriate and paste images on the building. Mies van der Rohe's assistant in the Seagram's building was Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson's version of the Seagram's building is what was the AT&T building on Madison Avenue at 57th. And if you look at his building, it's not the pure glass and steel structure of Mies van der Rohe, but it's pink granite with a highboy curlicue top and all this decoration. So they appropriate these images and use these images as a way of communicating with others. By the time you get to people like Koons and Damien Hirst and others, art and business, art and finance become inseparable. I mean, it's not just that high-power financiers are in a prestige competition by buying art and supporting museums, but they are currently creating hedge funds and private equity funds for the production and investment in art.
Can I ask you something? And yes, that's in fact true. And also, of course, art represents a great means by which to protect asset values. They talk about it. They talk about this as as a portfolio diversification, right?
Absolutely, right. So you got too much in stocks or in bonds, or you need to diversify your portfolio. And what happens is this art. So you invest in these funds, you never see the art. It's like it's the same structure as pork bellies or oil futures. Right.
Well, the interesting thing about that you're saying is, of course, also that as wealth inequality and capital leverages from labor and more accumulates at the top, these sort of assets that provide no real underlying value. In other words, even penthouse apartments become places to store
Correct.
To store capital, as opposed to like cap rates collapse, essentially.
Correct.
But what you're also sounds like you're saying, for me to try to understand this larger point, so that we can, because I want to also discuss sort of the turn. I want to really, before we get into this larger question about industrial, consumer, financial, and information capitalism, I also want to get into the individual, the sort of the transformation of the individual. But just to finish on this point here, on art, are you also saying that more generally, are you drawing a parallel between the artist as someone who deals in the abstraction, in the abstract world of creating value, what art is essentially, to financiers in a sense, because they're essentially creating multiple order derivatives that are removed from the underlying asset? That's what that's your larger philosophical point.
Yeah. Yes, I am. I mean, the last semester I was at Williams, I taught a course on massive multi-user online games. And the course predictably had 18 guys and 2 women. Right? And some of these students were, among the best college students in the country. But they were also playing, at that time, as World of Warcraft. Some of them playing that 40 hours a week.
Right.
And that's not a world, I try to understand it, but it's not a world I inhabit. But as I came to understand what was going on, it became clear to me that hedge funds and a lot of, not just hedge funds, but a lot of the, the trading that goes on is in effect a massive multi-user online game. And that the skills that these kids were developing that were going to be valuable to them were not the philosophical ideas I was trying to get them to understand. It was the skills they were developing in these games. And this, these people, a lot of these you know what the trading floors look like. I mean, they live in a virtual world in which the signifiers are completely detached from the signified, right? If you go back to your hedge funds, the trading that goes on in these high-speed networks is the antithesis of Warren Buffett's trading.
Right.
What Buffett does is to find a company, assess the value of its assets, the inventory, whatever it is, the personnel, and try to decide whether the stock price is what the relationship of the stock price is to the asset. The stock price is the signifier, the asset's the signified. So it's a correspondence between the signified and the signifier stock price and signified company that he, upon which he bases his investment. In high-speed hedge fund trading, it's completely different. The way in which you make money is on difference, right? And there are two ways to make money. You make a little money with a lot of trades or a lot of money with a few trades. As you move into high-speed trading, right, what's going on, as you know, is the assets that are being traded are not being assessed by the relationship to the actual company or whatever. It's these price differentials being traded algorithmically at hyper speed. So you have a complete decoupling of the signifier from the signifier.
And I would say also yes, and that's all. But I think that's true largely in general for all for a tremendous amount of financial transactions, regardless of whether they're happening electronically or not. It's the decoupling of the derivatives contract from the interested parties. The whole concept of I'm going to make a separate bet on some other person's on owning the fire insurance on some other person's house, and I'm
right. Or that's what the mortgage crisis was all about. Rather than a local bank having my house as collateral for for my mortgage, they're securitized and cut up, and so the value of the asset really, in general, it's somehow grounded in the houses, but that link has been completely decoupled.
I was going to say, all right, so two things. One is it's a very interesting sort of parallel that you drew initially with respect to a theological, a religious society and God, and a gold standard society and finance. One point I would make with respect to gold is I agree with you that it has no intrinsic value in the way you defined it. I think what makes it valuable specifically is that it is not a liability. It is not someone else's liability. And with respect to this art thing, I think this is very interesting. I want to make sure, because we do have limited time, I want to make sure, because there are a few things that I want to get to based on what you wrote. The one is the individual, this sort of progression. Because the way I see your work, like I said, there is this. You devote a significant amount of time in your book dealing with this evolution of the individual. You really focus on Luther, which is and the Protestant Reformation, and then you also talk about Aquinas and Ockham and Calvin and sort of all this. This transformation of the individual, I think, is very interesting. It's something that I want to discuss, and then I want to get into the transformation into consumer capitalism, and then I definitely, and I'll say you're very impressive with finance. I know the subject very well, and I'm very impressed by how well you understand.
There's another earlier book, I don't know if you looked at, called Confidence Games: Money and Markets in a World Without Redemption.
That's your book?
Yeah.
No, I didn't. No, you're very. Look, you understand this extremely well. I'm very impressed. The part that I learned a tremendous amount from reading your stuff on the individual. I want to get to that a second, and then And then I want to make sure that we get to your comments on technology as well. So why don't you give us sort of, the best summation of this of your work in this regard, and how you understand the transformation. Sort of the way I understand your work is you're looking at societies, Western society, and the place of the individual in society at a certain time, and that changed. The individual began to become empowered, and so it transformed also his sense of his place in the society, et cetera, et cetera. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see that transformation, where it took place, when it took place, how it took place, and sort of where we got to?
Sure. So I'll begin again where I began, and that's with Hegel and Kierkegaard. Hegel is the philosopher of the individual. He's sort of the grandfather of what's known as existentialism. For Hegel, the individual comes to its fullest expression in isolation and separation from all other individuals. Hegel's the philosopher of the group. For Hegel, the individual is what he or she is by virtue of his or her participation in the group or the whole. Hegel leads to Marx. Kierkegaard leads indirectly to Adam Smith in certain ways. But if you push this all the way back historically, I think the real beginnings of this debate go back to the late Middle Ages. During the High Middle Ages, the Catholic Church was all powerful. In order for people to be saved, they had to participate in the Church Universal, the Catholic Church, through the sacraments. So all the power was held by the clergy, and there was no salvation or redemption. I said the world. My other book is called A World Without Redemption. The redemption, I'm thinking both in terms of finance, but also in terms of religion. Right? You redeem paper currency for gold. Redemption is religious as well as economic. Luther comes along, and for a variety of reasons, says that each individual has an individual relationship to God that does not have to be mediated by the Church Universal. Now, that completely undercuts the power of the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church, which at this time was an extremely wealthy operation, although they had financial problems because of their expenditures, but Luther undercuts the importance of the church and says you don't need the church to be related to God, because God can freely choose to relate to any individual privately or alone. That undercuts the power of the church.
And I should also mention, that was, just for our audience as well, that may not be that familiar with the history of the Reformation, that was a revolutionary action on his part, a politically revolutionary action, and it completely put in the crosshairs of the Catholic Church.
Correct. I mean, that's where, in my reading, that's where modernity began.
With Luther. And would you also say with Luther and the technology of printing, that was integral to that, obviously?
There was no Reformation without Luther, and no Reformation without Gutenberg, and no Gutenberg without the Reformation, at least in the early stages.
The Gutenberg printing press is what you're saying.
At one point in Luther's life, there were 3.2 million copies of his tracts in print. 3.2 million. That's astonishing. In addition to spreading the faith, as it were, what Protestantism did was to cultivate literacy, which is absolutely critical for the development of capitalism. At the time, and Luther translated the Bible into vernacular German. At the time that his Bible came out, there were 14 other German editions, but Luther's vernacular language was very, very earthy, sometimes profane, was something that people could appreciate. There were also at that time several Catholic translations. But what happened was at the Council of Trent in 1540 or 41, the Catholics were trying to figure out how to get control of this Reformation that was running wild. And what they did at that time was to forbid any further translations of the Bible and restrict access to the Bible to the clergy who had the ability to read Latin. So, on the one hand, for Protestantism, there is an encouragement of literacy, and on the other hand, for Catholicism, there's a discouragement.
For people that are interested in printing, in the role of printing, not just for capitalism but politically, and also for the journalism community. Andrew Pettigrew does. You probably are familiar with Andrew Pettigrew. He's done some work on this, and the history of printing with respect to the growth of sort of what we think of as newsletters and we think of as newspapers is also a very fascinating history. And it came around this time as well because Luther's letters were really great sources of revenue for the printing service.
Yeah, but that's what I mean. That there wouldn't have been early printing industry without Luther. I should also mention that that there's an important element in printing in terms of the rise of industrialization, because you have the early industrialization of printing. But in addition to that, as you move from the handwritten manuscripts, in which there was no punctuation, and even the words were not separated, to print, you have the emergence of discrete elements organized in a logical succession, both on the printed page, but also in the printing process itself. It's possible to see in Gutenberg, right, the anticipation of Frederick Winslow Taylor's standardization. So you have standardization and regulation. But there's a contradiction, right? Because on the one hand, you have the emergence of the individual. On the other hand, you have this kind of standardization, right? And I'll come back to both those in a minute. Let me now go back to Luther's criticism of the Catholic Church. What Luther does is to disintermediate the church, to use the language of today's business school. He takes out the middle institution of the church and establishes a direct...
remarkably powerful.
Right. He disintermediates the church. He deregulates, decentralizes religion. Right. So you no longer have a centralized and hierarchical network, right, that is regulated.
That's huge, and I actually want to put emphasis on that, the importance of making that note. What you're saying is that the church was a centralized, centrally distributed system.
Hierarchical, centralized and hierarchical. It was top down.
Whereas Protestantism, philosophically, in the way that the information is spread, it's spread in a distributed, non-linear, peer-to-peer sort of manner in a way.
Correct. Bottom up.
Exactly. That's an important point. Very important.
If you look at it that way, you can see Luther, as a precursor of Milton Friedman. For the traditional God, worked out more fully by Calvin, we haven't talked about Calvin, God is omniscient and omnipresent and infallible. Now what happens in Calvin is that Calvin comes to see God. So Luther was not a systematic theologian. He was a pretty volatile guy.
Now, Calvin was born when Luther was alive, but he was younger than Luther, correct?
Correct.
He came in on about 10 years later or around?
Yeah, and he was in France. He got driven out of France and went over to Switzerland. He developed, he's second generation reformer, right? The community that he is preaching to is a much more established community. They have businesses and so on and so forth. Pretty sophisticated economic and financial
he's preaching
system.
To Protestants, correct? He's
correct. By that time, yeah,
to Protestants,
right,
and he's preaching a sense of predetermination. That's sort of the way that most people are taught.
What he's best known for is predestination. Providence and predestination. Calvin's primary image of God is God the Creator, but creation is not simply something done at the beginning. Rather, God is constantly creative. Without God's continuous creative power, everything falls into nothingness. So God's creativity God's creative power leads to his providence, right? And Calvin's God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. All-knowing, all-powerful, and always present. All right. So if you now let's make the transition to economics. If you look to the founder of what becomes neoliberal economics, that is Adam Smith, right? Many of those early political economists were Scots, and Scots are Calvinists. What what Smith in effect does is to translate God's transcendent providence into the immanent operation of the market. The market becomes omniscient, omnipresent. Within Christian theology, they have a notion that they call theodicy. And theodicy is the way you explain evil. If God is so great, why is the world evil? And the argument goes that God, in his omnipotence and omniscience and omnipresence, is able to work good out of evil, bring good out of evil. What Smith does is to reread Christian theodicy in terms of the market.
Well, it's also important to note as well for our audience that when we're talking about this, and it may seem a bit sort of hard to fathom, we're also talking about a time when, again, important to note, God was very central. The notion of God and a very particular Old Testament notion of God was a feature of the societal and fabric, the environment. It couldn't help but seep its way into all sorts of other endeavors.
But just as God works good out of evil, so the market, so in the operation of the market, each person seeking his or her own ends, in theology that's called sin, work for the good of the whole.
What I want to emphasize here in all your points is the thread of the individual. I mean, the individual is central here.
Right.
The individual was central in Luther's case because the individual had the capacity, was empowered in his relationship to God. He developed a direct relationship. It was his. It was personal. It was, as you refer to in your book, the turn inward. There was something very important, as I remember in my own study of Calvin's work, the notion of good works as being a testament to your predestination, to the fact that you had already been chosen by God to be a good person, and therefore doing good work simply showed what you were already predestined for.
Right. So that's an important point. The key insight of the Reformation comes from Luther's understanding of Romans 1:17. And Luther started out as a Catholic, as a monk, as an Augustinian monk, who was pretty messed up. And he tried to be a super monk by fulfilling the law and his obligations as fully as possible. The harder he tried, the less able he was to do so, until he had his revelation that salvation comes not through human works, but by God's grace. God gives that freely, and there's nothing you can do to achieve that. Now, if you think about the Protestant principle, and many of Calvinism, the Protestant principle, it gets misunderstood. You understood. You expressed it correctly. It's often misunderstood by saying that if you work hard, you will be saved. But for the Calvinist, and Calvin had a pretty bleak view of human being and the world. If there's nothing you can do about it and everything's in God's hand, you're going to be scared to death. I mean, wanting to know, am I saved? And for these people, the afterlife was not some kind of idle fantasy. It was totally real to them, right? And so they wanted proof. They wanted proof that they were saved. And as you suggest, the proof of that became worldly prosperity. So it's not that if you are good and fulfill the law, you prosper, but your prosperity testifies to the fact that you have been saved. But now when you combine that with the Calvinist aversion to excessive expenditure, I mean, what that led to was the accumulation of wealth that could be invested. So you, on the one hand, you have the motivation to succeed in worldly business, and on the other hand, not spend ostentatiously but save.
And that sets us up for the type of existential conflicts that American society experienced after the accumulation of massive amounts of wealth that came from decades of prosperity under the Industrial Revolution and all the subsequent sort of psychic schisms that we saw in the consumer-driven economy and in individuals like John Wanamaker.
Right.
But please, I don't want to take us off. You were also speaking about Adam Smith, and I diverted us there.
So basically, with Smith, right, you move from an external to an internal principle of control, right? But that and what that means is that you do not need any external control, right? Just as let's as human beings in a Calvinist or Lutheran theology can only screw things up, and you must leave it to the higher wisdom of God, right? So, in a neoliberal model of the economy, human beings can only screw up the market, but you can screw things up, and the market knows best. So you got to get rid of regulations and let the market do its thing. I mean, in effect, that notion of the market is a secularized notion of Protestant providence.
The other thing that I think is relevant to this, and this is how it comes across in my own reading of this sort of progression, is that Western liberal society was trying to find a way to build this radically new society.
Right.
This new society that was liberal, that was democratic, that increasingly respected the rights and freedoms of an individual, and we're trying to adapt the entire society, all of the models in society, to ones that would be complementary to that. And so, the way I view Adam Smith in this sort of way that you're describing the market and sort of the Hayekian idea of spontaneous order.
Exactly, it's Hayek. Exactly.
Right. Is looking to develop, is looking for that system, for a system by which we can be free, by which we can operate. Anyway, yes, please continue. So I just wanted to contextualize that.
Let me now bring it back to this notion of the individual that you've raised, and make the link to the other topic you say you want to discuss, and that's technology. Now, I indicated a few minutes ago that there was a tension in Luther in the use of print. I mean, print was the first mass medium. All right. So on the one hand, Luther's notion of religion individualizes and privatizes. On the other hand, right, there's a certain standardization that goes with publication. And that standardization is not only in the format of the printed page, but it's also in the ideas that are disseminated. Kierkegaard was the first one to develop a criticism of mass media. And he did it in a work called The Present Age in 1845, I think it was. And the target of that criticism was the press, print. Because he said that what the modern press did was to repress the individuals, was to repress people's individuality and make them channels for public opinion disseminated through the mass media. Right. So they weren't any longer developing their own ideas. They were just repeating what he called idle chatter. We would call it the pundits today, right? The idle chatter of pundits or the public press, and had lost all sense of their own individuality. Now, if you think about that more fully, right, what we have in today's world with today's technologies is a massive extrapolation of that, right? Again, the combination of big data and high-speed computing, right, is making it possible for companies, for political parties, and the like, right, to in effect program our minds.
It's an interesting point you make. I would say yes, but I think one of what I've sort of seen occurring is actually I think we reached the high point of homogeneity in terms of common narrative within the structure of society, which is the nation state, at some point in the 70s or maybe 80s. But I think what we have now is, yes, absolutely, with big data, we have we're much better at propagandizing, much better at manipulating minds, but we also have more heterogeneity within that larger sort of system of control.
So here's the way that works. Again, if you go back to the 60s and 70s, when I was beginning to think about some of this, one of the chief and very early theorist of electronic technology was Marshall McLuhan. And his works are still worth reading. I teach them in a course I teach on media. And for McLuhan saw great potential in electronic media because he thought it was going to bring people together, that it was going to make the world in some sense more unified. It was going to create, in his famous phrase, the global village. When I began to get into the actual use of these media in the late 80s and early 90s, I had a similar sense that, we must remember when this was all happening, all right? I mentioned 87. That was the financial crash. But you also had, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Berlin Wall. And in my judgment, I have always thought that the end of the Soviet Union was not so much a function of Reagan's Star Wars and defense stuff as it was of mass communications and of consumer capitalism as it became known through mass communications. Once people began to know what was on the other side of that wall, there was no way that wall was going to stand. So we were moving at that time, the way I discussed, from a world of walls to a world of webs. Right, and there was all optimistic. You had Francis Fukuyama, the end of history, and so on and so forth. Needless to say, that's hardly the way it's worked out. We now live in a world where webs have given rise to the creation of literal and virtual walls, right, politically. But in addition to that, and this is now to your point, these technologies that were supposed to unite us, the technologies themselves, are dividing us. So rather than Kierkegaard's problem of everybody thinking the same way, there is a homogeneity. But you have what has happened now is the creation of these silos, right, within which there's subgroups. Now, what I would insist, and they become echo chambers. Now, what I would insist is that with it, so you have heterogeneity rather than, the mass communication. I mean, the shift from industrial capitalism to financial capitalism is a shift from mass from mass consumption to customized consumption, right?
That's actually a good point. I want to hold you there for a second. I think that's something that I really want our audience to meditate on.
Well, let's go back to John Wanamaker.
We should give our audience an introduction on who he is.
All right, so let's talk about department stores. So what you have? So you have mass production. Prior to the time you had mass production, the exchange process took place in different stores, and so you would go into the little shop on your street and enter into a negotiation with the shop owner. Once you have mass consumption or mass production, the first thing you have to produce is mass consumption. All right, right. Because you have to have people buying the stuff that's coming off the factory line. So one of the ways in which mass consumption was promoted was through the emergence of department stores in the 1950s, right? Bon Marché in France, I think it was 1951. All that depended on new architecture of glass and steel architecture, right? Which developed after the work of John Paxton, who designed the Crystal Palace for the 1851 World's Fair. That style of steel and glass architecture was taken over for the arcades, train stations, and the like, and became
the arcades. Arcades is another word for malls.
Yeah, basically, what happened was those streets where all the little shops were, they put glass and steel over the top of them, right? And you're right, they're the early versions of the mall. But in addition to creating department stores, and I'll come back to Wanamaker in a minute, right? What does department store do? It sets up different departments. So just like the printed page has separate letters arranged in a line, just like the production line has different stages of labor all in a line. What the department store does is to set up different departments for different items, and they introduce fixed prices. So rather than enter into a negotiation, the shoes or whatever all have a fixed price, and you don't go in and argue about it. You go in and pay the price, or you don't pay the price. Wanamaker is interesting because you had Wanamaker's, you had Macy's,
The Strauss family.
The Strauss family. But what's not much known is that modern art, modern European art in America, was first introduced in America in department stores. And John Wanamaker's, one of the ways he tried to get customers in his department store was basically to show art. It wasn't in the museums at that time initially. It was in these department stores. So I mean, you have this really interesting relationship. And I'm not talking about kitsch here. I'm talking about, the masters of high modernism. That's where they were introduced. Go back all the way down to Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol, Johns and some of these people, their day job in the 60s and 70s was as window designers. Right?
Well, in fact, Frank L. Baum
was
a set
Wizard
designer.
of Oz. That's what he did.
He wrote The Wizard of Oz, of course, and he was a set designer. And the staging of windows and the explosion of glass. I don't remember the United States was by far the largest consumer of plate glass.
Right. Plate glass was a huge innovation because so if you go back to the shop on the street that you go into the butcher and negotiate with, what happens with the introduction of plate glass? You have the appearance of the commodity in the window. Right, so it's detached.
Very tempting.
It's detached from. I mean, often the store, if you're buying textiles, the store where you were buying the stuff is where the product was produced. So you now have the detachment of the image of the product from the thing itself. Here's one of your first uncoupling a signifier from signified, and we talk about mass production, right? So mass production, all cereals are the same. So how are you going to differentiate them? You're going to differentiate them by their images, by their logos, and by design, right? So when in a consumer economy, what people are buying is not the thing, it's the image. It's the image, right? They're buying the image, right? So again, the introduction of the display window.
It's a very powerful point. You've made it a few times during our conversation. I couldn't agree with you more. It's something that I reflect on often, and it's become, of course, I'm sure this is where you're taking this conversation as well. It's become increasingly true in the world that we live in.
Totally. Right. Online shopping is this on steroids?
Well, the purchasing of virtual wares in the most literal sense of the word.
Right.
But,
that's the point. It's a purchasing of virtual wares. It's the trading of virtual security. I mean, these securities aren't securities. They're insecurities, right? They're nothing. I mean, they're grounded in nothing. It's ether, right?
Which is actually
it's a confidence game.
Right.
Now, you understand confidence game in two senses of the word, right? Question of confidence. You got to have confidence in these securities. Why do they call them securities? And it's a confidence game. It's a con.
Well, it all depends on, as you said, it all depends on confidence and trust in the system and in the.
Good luck today.
I agree with you. The difficulty, of course, is it's certainly. I think it's impossible for any individual to be able to time that type of a sort of, and that's what, of course, a financial panic is. It is a sudden loss of trust in which the vacuum in prices emerges from people realizing that it's all in our heads.
Right.
There is no tangible foundation of any sort of significance insofar as where pricing is.
That's right.
I want to what's the term? I want to make sure that we don't leave something on the table here with respect to the standardization. I really want to drive this point home. This, I think, is a very, very powerful idea because, in fact, as you mentioned with Gutenberg and the printing press, and in fact, I think it's even more significant than perhaps people are recognizing. It wasn't just that, in my view, that the printing press required physically, it required standardization of paper, standardization of letters, and all the rest of it. But there was also a larger sort of information revolution underway,
right?
And the ability, and therefore the need to organize society all of a sudden became something that hadn't existed before. And we saw that standardization everywhere. We saw it, of course, as you mentioned in your book, in the standardization of timetables, railroads, longitude, ships. I mean, everything in our world today.
Typewriters, index cards, file folders. Right.
Oh, the Dewey Decimal System.
Dewey Decimal System is proto-Google. Google.
Yes, which is
it's a search.
And you know what? I'm sure that there will be many listeners in our audience who have never used a card catalog.
Right. I can't get my students into the damn library.
I hated the card. Listen, I'll tell you something. I hated the card.
Right.
I really hated it. I never enjoyed it. I found it appalling. And I'm very happy to be gone with it. But this sort of it isn't. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of James Blake.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
So you've read The Information.
Yeah, sure.
Now, that's a fantastic book.
He's a popular science writer, and he has a book called Faster that deals with some of these issues. So
also, his latest book is a book actually on time travel and time travel's place in the sort of popular culture. But I'll tell also our audience, The Information is by far, in terms of a history of this sort of intangible notion. I don't even know how I would describe what information is really in a way that's useful right now for this discussion. But in terms of information, as a physical thing, perhaps I have not found a more concise read than James Blake's book. And to stamp that point, being with the standardization and everything, we live in a very information-intense world, and in order for all the systems in our world to function, we need to process information. Which is why, if we were to shut down, one of the conversations that I've had with I forget who it was recently. I think it was actually with David Kirkpatrick. I just had an interview with him a few days ago. We were discussing this in the event of an EMP attack in the United States. Or a solar flare, or something that were to knock out our electrical system, we would be blind. I mean, we would not be able to function, and therefore, the standardization aspect is central to this need and this evolution, very slow and arduous process of evolving over decades and centuries, systems by which we could take advantage of the industrial innovations, the physical innovations that we achieved, to get to the point where we are today, where we are spending more and more time in abstractions.
Right. So one way to think about this is as making the distinction is made in information theory between information and noise or interference. Right. Now,
excellent point.
I don't think there's any such thing as absolute noise. I think that what is noise in one condition is information in another, and vice versa. With the information overload, as we talk about it, what you need are filters. That is to say, you need a way to process all of this noise and to transfer it into information in some ways. And the image that I like...
By information, what you're really saying, because noise is, in fact, more information dense than...
Correct. I always say noise is information in the process of formation. Hyphenate information.
This is I did not take computer science in college, despite sort of what the track
Neither did I
took. Right. But I found it fascinating, and Blake's book was sort of instrumental in my understanding of this, thinking of noise and information as the equivalent of entropy in the physical sciences.
No, but that's in original information theory as it was developed. That was the distinction that they made, right? Because in the strict notion of information theory, as it was originally developed,
Claude Shannon, a father of information theory,
that information is inversely proportional to probability.
Exactly.
Now, all right. So what does that mean? It's a complicated way and it's all mathematical. But here's what it means: which sequence gives you more information? A, B, C, D, E, or X, J, K, V? And the answer is the second gives you more information, because in the first is utterly predictable, and so you know what the next one is going to be.
So what you're really telling our audience is that the more that with respect to probability, another way of saying it is that the more information, the more possibility. The more
Correct.
Information there is, the more options there are. And that has to do with also, that goes to the issue of cryptography and to the issue of
probability, black swans, the whole
and compression, file compression.
Right,
I mean, the way we're able to compress images, the way we're able to compress. The reason why video is more compressible than photography is because it's more predictable. We know if there's a scene,
there's less information.
Exactly, and that's actually why also sports, I believe, is probably less. I don't know this as a fact, but I assume a sports program is less compressible because it's more unpredictable. You don't know necessarily where the ball is going to be. You can't make it a prediction. But if you're watching Walter Cronkite sitting at a news desk, he's not going to change much.
Right. So I mean, look at the word program. It means written before, or prescription. It means written before. So what the program does, Friedrich, is to attempt to program the future. That is to control the future, right? By making an extension of the past. But of course, that's not the way the future works, right? Because there's an interruption and an eruption of the unexpected.
Now you're getting into portfolio theory. Someone in our audience will know that.
Do not want to insult people in your audience, but very often it seems to me some of these economists get Nobel Prizes for stating the obvious. I mean, what does portfolio really say? It says don't put all your eggs in one basket.
No, my audience hates portfolio theory. I'm sure. I mean, so let's tell our audience, because again, I'm creating a new audience here. My original audience was very financial, and they were literate. But why don't you explain to our audience what sort of, in a nutshell, in your best explanation, what portfolio is and the significance and why I mentioned it in the context of predicting the future and sort of, preordaining.
Basically, as I understand it, and remember, I never took a course in economics.
You're far. Listen, I like I said, you're much more impressive in your understanding and your explanations of finance than most anyone else. I can tell you that.
Well,
I can tell you that very clearly. I read your book. You understand it very.
I never took a course in economics in my life, so
that helped you.
Right. That's what I say. Economics is too important to be left to economists. I mean, so basically, if you look at a range of investments, right? You want to distribute your investments across a range of securities that won't all move in the same direction at one time, right? And so, I mean, if you have all of your investments in Google, right, and Google keeps going up, you're lucky. But if you have all your investments in Yahoo, right, you're not so lucky. So what you want to do is to distribute them not only between and among different securities within a particular sector, but between and among different asset classes, right? And they may not only be within security, but, people with lots of money, they will distribute them, in securities and bonds. But as we were saying earlier, even that isn't enough. And so then what they do, they need other so-called financial instruments, right? Interesting language, right? And that's part of what leads to the generation of all of these, increasingly esoteric financial products. But it also is what leads to something like what we were just talking about in terms of commodities of different kinds, whether it be oil futures or paintings. It's even possible to invest in a share of racehorses, so that you don't own the whole horse, but you have a certain share in a racehorse, a particular racehorse or a stable, right? That and share in its profits. So
the financial world is one of the most creative places that you can possibly operate when it comes to just sort of just in your head. I mean, it is remarkable what you can do with financial derivatives. I mean, just one small example, of course, was during in the lead up to the crisis. In order to be able to maintain large amounts of leverage, firms, instead of selling assets, would buy derivatives that supposedly protected them from that asset devaluing, which just was just created more complexity in the system. I'll just make a capping point, and I want you to continue because we're getting probably a little diverted. You were making some points. I divert you. I divert you easily.
I want to come back to speed. And Marcus.
Yes. So I'll just make that the capping point there, which is that in essence, in finance, everyone is always looking to try and find sort of the I'm forgetting the word in mythology. But anyway, they're looking for that magic formula, and they wanna get money for nothing. And so portfolio theory is just another way in which financial professionals have tried to convince themselves that they've mitigated risk, when in fact they haven't, because markets can still move and can correlate. Bonds can collapse. Bond prices can also fall at the time that equities are falling, despite what portfolio theory says.
What you're suggesting is it's one hedging strategy,
right? Which has proven false. What consistently we have been taught over time is that these sort of standard theories, standard practices of risk mitigation fall apart at the time that they are most needed.
Correct.
So why don't you then go where you were saying you were talking about speed?
So if you come back to the issue of speed in these financial markets, right? So one assumption is that wealth must grow, right? The capitalism is dedicated to growth. Now, it's not clear to me, and again, I'm not an economic historian, that that's always been the case. It definitely became a very, very important point during the Cold War, because part of what the competition between the Soviet Union and the Western world, or the United States, let's say, the SU and the U.S., was the argument about whether a centralized and hierarchical economic system or a decentralized and deregulated system would produce more goods for more people more effectively. All right. Once you are committed to growth, there are only three ways that I can figure out in which markets can grow. They can grow spatially, that is, you open a new store or firm in another city or country. You can grow differentially, right, by making a different variation of the product. It usually isn't different, right? How many different color iPhones are there, or different colors? Right? Or, and this is the most important one, they can grow temporally. That is, you accelerate the product cycle. So, for instance, if we go back to the Industrial Revolution we were talking about at one point, Henry Ford once said famously, "You can have any color you want, only as long as it's black."
So, sorry, because I was meditating on what you said. So, what you're essentially saying is there are three ways to grow the physical economy. One is to expand the product universe. One is to expand the product universe. One is to expand optionality, customization, choice, and the third is to accelerate the pace of innovation, so that you're creating. But in all those cases, you're still creating more stuff. It's just a different way of getting there, and all three of those things happen together.
If you look, example, let's look at fashion. So I said, we have standardization with mass production and everything. Well, once everybody gets the car or the dress or whatever, you got to figure out another way to get people to buy what they don't need. Because if people only buy what they need, the wheels of production are going to fall to, are going to grind to a halt. So they seek to create desire where there is no need. That's what advertising does. But why were fashion seasons originally introduced? You had fall and you had spring. Well, the reason it introduced was to try to have a product cycle so that people would begin to buy what they don't need. Now, we've gone from 1, 2, or 3 seasons to what's known as fast fashion, right? In Zara or in H&M, where they turn over the products in the store every 3 weeks, right? The annual models of cars were not introduced in this country until the 1960s. The average time, other than the house, the car is probably the major investment for many people. The average time an American owns a car is 3.5 years, which is crazy in my judgment. But the point is that you accelerate the product cycle. The same thing goes on once you have the virtualization of assets. So that the way you increase wealth is by acceleration. All right. Now we get to the point that I want to emphasize because I think it's very important and not understood. We have a lot about the wealth gap, the growing gap between those who have wealth and those who don't. The wealth gap is in effect a speed gap because we have two economies working at different speeds. You have the real economy, right, which works at a certain speed. So when I was in college, the guys, and they mostly were guys, who were going to make the most money were going to be doctors. Not anymore.
Definitely not anymore.
Why?
Every one of my family is a physician, so I know the plight of the medical industry.
Yeah, but why? Being a doctor, like being a teacher, doesn't scale. You can only see so many patients an hour.
Absolutely.
You can only have so many students in a class unless you go virtual. Virtual assets scale at an astronomical rate, right? And so you have virtual assets. They also can disappear fast too. But you have virtual assets multiplying at an exponential rate, while sort of real assets or real labor doesn't. And there is no way you're going to bridge that gap because it's structural.
That's sort of the notion as well. And we should say, just for anyone that's unfamiliar with the term scale, it's very much literally scale.
Right.
If you scale an image up or down, you're speaking also to something else which is known as the zero marginal cost economy. This idea that once you develop the idea, once you sort of have the IP, the intellectual property, the cost of reproducing that is minimal to zero.
Right.
And therefore you can service the entire globe with your product as long as it's slightly superior and or slightly cheaper than your competitors.
Right.
Which, of course, a physician cannot do.
But, this rate of acceptance is out of control. So when Obama was elected, seems longer ago since the recent election, but it's not that long. When Obama was elected, the iPhone had not been introduced.
Isn't that remarkable? Isn't that absolutely? I was thinking about. I have to say something. I was thinking about this recently. It was a morning recently, maybe 2 mornings ago. I was up, and of course, I've thought about that before, but about the fact that the iPhone came out in 2007,
right?
Or what wherever it was about that.
Right.
But then what is even more remarkable to me is where we were in 2004.
Yeah.
Pre-YouTube,
Right.
and then I thought as well about the fact that in 1994 I was using AOL.
Right.
10 years later, the economy had changed so dramatically.
Right.
And yet we've changed much more in the last 10 years than we did in those. And yet for those 10 years, going from being on dial-up to being in a world where you're using Google and you have mobile phones and all this stuff, the rate of change is tremendous.
So, and that's an important point. It's not only that things are getting faster, but the rate of acceleration is itself accelerating.
Exactly, which is that is a point also to your issue, this sort of notion of derivatives.
Right.
It is that the rate of change is itself changing.
Accelerating. Right.
Accelerating.
Right. And, and that brings with it a lot of negative effects. It seems to me.
Another way I think of it to complement what you're saying is that the creative destruction notion of Schumpeter, you're taking out, in my view, you're taking out the strength of the creative process, and not the strength of the creative process. You're simply not allowing, and this is a point I actually made in my interview recently with David Kirkpatrick. He pushed back on it. He made some valid points, but my point is really that creative destruction requires that in the process of destruction there is time for incubation and growth for creation. But when you're destroying, for example, with the projections that we have on automated cars and automation, destroying, there's just a projection, but there's a consensus that we're going to lose a tremendous number of jobs in the next 5 years due to automation.
Yeah.
Those jobs will be lost at such a pace that the creative aspects of the economy can't simply replace them in time.
There's no way. Yeah, correct. So the notion of innovation has become a fetish, but innovation is simply a different way of talking about creative destruction, as you say. I think it is also the case that not all innovation is creative. Some of it is simply destructive, right? Who needs a 10th iPhone, right? Again, it's it's consumption for consumption's sake in that sense. It's a way of expanding the economy. And the other thing,
there's also, and I will, to strengthen your point there, that feeds into your point about growth and about the way we measure growth, which is gross domestic product.
Correct.
And therefore, we will, for example, during the housing boom, we built a lot of houses. We expended capital, labor, resources towards that end. We misallocated that capital. Asset prices inflated, and we built. Not only did we misvalue the assets and cause a crisis as a result of that, but in some cases we created negative value. In other words, if we need that land for some other purpose, but we built a mall on it, we've actually gone out of our way to destroy wealth.
But it's not only that, but this system that we have set up is simply unsustainable, period.
Well, that is a larger point. And
we are destroying the natural world and system upon which we depend. Right. I end the book, as you know, by going to Iceland, which is where the 2008 financial crisis really was triggered, and where the glaciers are melting at a faster rate than anywhere else in the world. It's a longer thing than we get into now, but.
No, tell us. Because that was and I'll say it was a depressing thing to read. It's something that I've tried to educate myself on, but it's one of those subjects that's very difficult.
So one of the fundamental characteristics of today's financial markets is that there are emergent, complex, adaptive systems that are positive feedback. The economists, ever since I forget who the guy was originally, have sort of have as one of their fundamental premises the notion of equilibrium. An equilibrium system is a negative feedback system. These complex systems are positive feedback systems, which means that they develop what's called self-organized criticality. Gladwell popularized it as the tipping point. They self-organize toward the edge of chaos, at which time there is a phase shift and a new stage emerges. Now, I think these emergent, complex, adaptive systems have a structure and operational logic that is isomorphic across media. That is to say, I think they work the same way in physical systems, in economic systems, and social systems, and it's a distinctive structure and logic. So, if you look at the way, I think the natural world and climate systems are emergent, complex, adaptive systems that are formally the same, operate the same way as financial systems. All right, and when you look at it that way, these systems, which all interact, self-organize toward a tipping point. Right, and that's what's happening. Right, in terms of these economies that sort of keep expanding, cut down the friggin' rainforest down in the Amazon, and the system collapses. Or once the ice caps, by 20-something, all the glaciers in Nepal and Tibet will have melted. And those are the glaciers that supply all the water for the 4 major rivers in Asia.
Well, I want to say, so what you're talking about really is complexity. Complexity as a notion, a mathematical, a theoretical, and practical notion of organization, and chaos, which is complexity is really sort of on the edge of chaos.
Right.
Complexity is
complex systems drift toward the edge of chaos.
Exactly.
Right? At which it's called, the theory of problems is called punctuated equilibrium. So, but it's not a cyclical balancing thing. It moves toward this point. And what all the debate about climate change is now is whether we have already passed that point of self-organized criticality. That is to say, whether the systems have organized toward this to the point at which you can't get the toothpaste back in the tube. Right now, not clear whether it has, but what is clear, what is absolute, and
that's one of the features of a complex system. That's part of the problem. You don't know.
Correct.
That's sort of the feature. It's so complex that you don't know if the butterfly that flaps its wings in Australia causes a monsoon.
But if what we're talking about is the systems that sustain life itself, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of sense to know which way to make that bet.
Right. Well, to speak to your point about the system that we live in, the issue is that one of the issues, and this also ties into a lot of what you say about how a lot of. We didn't talk much about Hayek, but we mentioned him a little bit, which was sort of the information problem, and pricing, and sort of finding a way to convey information. He's done a lot of great work in that regard.
Right.
But the issue is that we do not do a good job of pricing.
Correct.
Much of what is transacted in the economy. Certainly, we do not price the externalities, the pollutions, all the different ways in which firms, companies, and individuals offset costs onto the environment and onto other people. The prison system, all these things are externalities.
Right.
And then, of course, there's also the financial system.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think anything's external. In other words, I think what is regarded as external is internal to the system itself, right?
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Okay,
it's the most essential aspect.
And that's part of the dilemma. These complex systems have as the condition of their possibility that which will eventually undo them.
The thing you're describing is the fat tail. It's the black swan. Yeah. It's the unknowable or unforeseeable event that eventually becomes, or the improbable event that eventually becomes probable, because there are so many improbable events that they accumulate to near certainty.
If you look at the issue of wealth, fast fashion, right? So a condition of the possibility of growth is the production of waste. Right, all the clothes or all the.
It's horrifying.
Let's go back to our virtual economy. They aren't virtual because they depend upon material conditions.
Well, servers running using
Bitcoin using
and
energy, but not only that, they depend upon precious metals that have to be mined and processed, right? Whether it's Africa or when the ice caps start melting, what do they want to do? They're all staking their claims up there. Why? Because they want to be able to drill for oil and gain precious metals from under the ice cap. So what do? Right? As the ice cap melts, permafrost melts, right?
Oh, God, that's one of the most frightening aspects.
Correct, because permafrost.
Why don't you explain it to our audience?
Right. So, first of all, you can look at the melting of sea ice as an example of this positive feedback system. Sea ice is very, very important in the regulation of global temperatures. Why? Because it reflects the rays of the sun back into the sky and therefore prevents warming. What happens as the sea ice melts is the water gets warmer. And what happens as the water gets warmer is more sea ice melts. So the more the ice melts, the warmer it gets, the more the sea ice melts, right? When glaciers melt, they expose permafrost. Permafrost is made up of organic material that doesn't fully decompose. And permafrost is filled with methane. So that when permafrost melts, it releases huge amounts of methane into the atmosphere, which increases the temperature of the atmosphere, which melts more ice, which releases more methane, and you've got this positive feedback effect.
It's horrifying. And the sheet ice aspect.
All the sheet ice, all the sea ice is going to be gone. I forget what the most recent, but it's much, much faster than they had previously thought. We're talking a decade or a decade and a half. We're not talking a century.
Well, that's the nonlinear. Well,
that's nonlinear.
These are nonlinear. These are projections, of course, and it is important. But what is for certain is the nonlinearity, the way in which ecosystems, and in this case, we're talking about the warming of the climate, proceeds to warm.
Right.
That's not something both the global temperatures as well as regions. A great example, of course, is the transatlantic sea current,
right,
whose warming changes can radically upset temperatures in Europe in ways that we don't normally think of. Hurricane Sandy, same thing.
That's right.
The hurricanes moving further north. Again, an example.
In all of this, I think one of the very most critical issues of the 21st century is going to be water. Right, its availability. Some places have too much, some places have too little, as you're talking about the floods and hurricanes. vast areas in China are desert. They don't have enough water. And what are they going to do when the glaciers no longer fill in these rivers? I mean, water is one of the most critical strategic assets that is not being regarded as such. Right? You can live without oil. You can't live without water.
You're 100% correct. And certainly certain people in the Pentagon, certain people in the government do understand this. And there is a sort of a quiet consensus that there is no yet solution for it. I mean, these issues of resource depletion, resource scarcity is that it's always one of the central issues driving wars over the course
Correct.
of history. I think
but all this. And this is the point, is tied into the economic system and the financial system. In other words,
right.
all of these environment and climate issues are, all this started with the Industrial Revolution, right? Cut down all the trees and burn oil. I mean, that's when you move from, an energy system based on natural, air and water, right? Windmills and waterfalls, to timber and fossil fuels, right? That's what made the Industrial Revolution possible, right? But that's also then what started the climate debacle that we're now living through. This is not fiction. This is fact. I mean, you cannot continue what's going on without destroying the very conditions upon which life on this planet depends. Period.
So what is? Let me ask you something. In the interest of time as well.
We got to wind up pretty soon.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so let's cap it off on that. I mean, what we talked about. I'm very happy actually with the scope of the discussion. We got into more than enough topics, and although we didn't necessarily close any one of them off in particular, I want to get a sense. I mean, you've been teaching, you said, for more than 30 years.
Right.
You've been around
over 40.
Over 40 years. So you've been around a long time. You've seen a lot of things. You said you graduated in 1968.
Correct.
You have seen a great deal. You're a very educated man. I've read your work. You're a smart guy. What is your perspective? Not perspective. What do you if you can be as objective as you can without sort of, what do you think? What do you see the future as? How do you see things coming together? Where do you see us, where do you see us over the next 5, 10, 20 years? What are the biggest problems and how can we overcome them in your view? Can we overcome them?
Well, it's difficult. Whenever you teach, it's always complicated to know whether to tell the students some of the things you really think, because they're young and you can't take hope away from them. Or I have 4 grandchildren, and I try to imagine what their world is going to be. I'm not overly optimistic. I think that the world in which we find ourselves at this particular moment, not only in this country but across the world, right, represents ideas and ideologies that are the exact opposite of what is needed. Right? What is most needed is to understand the interrelation and codependence of not only all peoples but of all things. Nietzsche says everything's entwined, enmeshed, interrelated. Right? No one, no thing, no country can be itself by itself, but can only be itself in and through its relationship with others. Right? And until we learn our codependence and our interrelationship with other people, with other countries, with other races, right, with the natural world, we're on a path to destruction. And there is no getting away from that destruction other than the cultivation of those systems and structures that support that interdependence.
I agree with you. I don't actually think there. Well, I was going to say I don't see how we're going to get to a place in a society where we can appreciate that, because everything we do moves us more towards this sort of siloed approach. There are ways around it, and I'm certainly not someone. I definitely don't take the view. I more as a result of necessity. I can't take the view that there's sort of no no way out, even though I share your sentiment.
Here's one way to think about it. If I can go back to my ghost Hegel, and again, this is a complicated idea. It's called a dialectical relationship. In a dialectical relationship, that which appears to be those things that appear to be opposites are interrelated and mutually constitutive. It's what I was saying a minute ago. I can't be myself without you. You can't be yourself without me, and so on and so forth. One of the paradoxes that you see when you think dialectically is that the very effort to assert your independence of the other through the negation of that other discloses your interdependence with that other. So, what does that mean? We can look at that in the relationship between two individuals or two people. But let's look at it human nature. All right. In our very effort to master, control, and dominate the natural environment, we are revealing our inextricable dependence on that environment. Right?
Very good point.
Right. And so it's sort of what we call a double negation. You attempt to negate that, but in that very effort, you negate yourself. Right. And the only way to get over that is through a movement of mutuality, in which you understand, right, as I say, the codependence of those two. Now, a lot gets lost in that first moment of negation, right? That is to say, a lot of destruction takes place, right? Hegel talks about in terms of master-slave relationship, right? Or all different other kinds of ways to think about this. But there's no easy way out of that. But what you do know is that no nation is only the first, that all nations are only interdependent. And the very effort to establish, right, one's own dominance eventually will collapse and reveal one's own interdependence.
There's a listener or an audience member who went to Harvard Divinity School with you.
Oh, yeah?
But that's something I say that mainly because I was just listening to you talk during the course of this entire interview. I am reminded of this underlying, not just philosophical, but very much theological undertone to what you're talking about. And in this case, of course, the notion of the duality.
Right.
I think we're at an appropriate place to end it, and where I would like to end this interview is, I've sort of thought about this a bit on my own, which is, do I want to try and ask my guests, to the extent that it's possible, where I think it's appropriate, what their view, how they conceptualize the world, the nature of our world, where we come from, what the sort of source of life is, what, some people call it God, some people call it atoms, electrons, whatever it is, what is your view? How do you, and it's so difficult to articulate clearly, but, especially given the fact that you went to Harvard Divinity School, you have concerned yourself so much with the subject, and you're writing a book on the subject of death, as I understand it.
Right.
That's your next book.
Right.
What is sort of your... How do you? Where do you come down on this subject? And I don't mean to. By the way, when I pose that question, I don't mean it in any type of binary way. Like, do you believe in this or that? I mean, what do you believe? What do you feel? What do you know?
I mean, more or less. That's what I just articulated in these last answers. I mean, I think reality, both natural and social, is this kind of complex, emergent network, right? That vision of the world as this kind of complex emergent network is a 21st century version of what Hegel was talking about in his understanding of these interrelated systems. I think that as I said, nobody is what he or she is alone. I think each person, each entity, each thing is like a node in this network whose identity is a function of its interrelationship with all of these differences. I think there's no personal immortality. I think that we are what we are in that network, and what we have done will continue to work itself out after our deaths in ways that we cannot imagine, and in a very, very short time will be completely forgotten and obliterated.
But when you're talking about this complex emergent system, are you taking this deeper than just organic and physical matter? Are you describing, because clearly we're talking about information systems here, which
you're talking about, you're talking about all that. You're talking about you're talking about not, but also cultural. That's what, it's not just information, it's what art, it's what religion, they're all, Hegel famously said that, that truth manifests itself in art, religion, and philosophy, in different ways.
You don't believe in absolute truth?
No, I don't believe in absolute. I think I think the only absolute truth is relativity. That is to say, I think that, Hegel says truth is the whole. What does he mean by that? Truth is a function of the interrelationship and the interconnection of all of these nodes and webs, right? It's not anything that is, there's nothing outside the network.
Well, even the notion of outside is something that is. Well, I think it sounds to me like you'd probably accept. Also, we're very limited in our capacity to appreciate.
Yeah.
We can, and I think that to me, in another interview you had it with another guest of ours. The subject there was artificial intelligence, but of course, there's a strong philosophical component to that.
Right.
And we ended it with sort of, at some point we had this, we didn't end it, at some point we got to this question, and I said, for me the most compelling sort of notion of reality is informational. And I struggled with that. He made a good point, which was that, even information needs to be stored somewhere. And he said that the best sort of notion or idea he heard that describes something that approximates what I said that he sort of feels is that, and I think this is some philosopher said this, that the base reality is difference.
Yeah. There's
something that rings true about that.
Yeah. It's part of what I just said. Hegel already said it. Derrida says it. Identity is difference.
Right.
What makes me what I am is my difference from others, which is a relationship to others. Take me outside of those relationships, and I am completely indeterminate. Relations are constitutive. The relation to difference is constitutive of identity.
I'm excited to read your upcoming book.
Okay.
I know that you've had some.
Look at confidence games.
So what I do want to tell. So as I mentioned, I am looking forward to your book coming up. There are a number of books that when I was working, in preparation of this conference, I mentioned, and after I had my own experience, I read a number of books. I read Mortality by Hitchens. I read Sherwin Nuland's book. I read Kalithi's book, and a number of books on mortality. And I think it's to me it's perhaps. Not perhaps. I think it's the most significant subject. Sort of, ultimately, that's what we're all contending with.
Yeah, right. Well, I've already died once, so this is the afterlife for me.
Well, I wish that we could talk about that. I'm sure. I hope one day we can with your other book. I look forward to it. Professor, I really appreciate it coming on. It's a pleasure for me to be able to read someone's book, in particular a book as intelligent as yours, and then to have an opportunity to hold you captive for 2 hours and pick your brain and hear you talk. It's really great.
I've enjoyed it too. Writing is an odd business. You sit in isolation for weeks or months, send the message out in the bottle, and you're never sure it arrives on shore. So it has arrived with you, and I appreciate it.
It's a very courageous. It's a very courageous process.
Right.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Okay. Thanks.
That was my conversation with Mark C. Taylor. I want to thank Mark for being on my program. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Connor Lynch. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforcespod.com. Join the conversation on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforcespod.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.